everybody. Welcome to our San Francisco Applied Innovation Exchange. We have been running this event, what's now, for 3 years. So 4 years. Thank you, Pete. So very happy tonight. AI is a big topic for us, for our clients. We are running every day a lot of projects on that topic, and we really like to invite people like Gary, thought leaders. It allows us to actually exchange big ideas with our clients, with our partners, and with our employees. So I'm very delighted to have this session for you tonight. So Pete, I guess you're going to be the moderator of this event. So welcome, and Gary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, Capgemini. Thank you, Jean-Claude. It is our 4th year. I didn't want to make it clear that. We've been going 4 years here. We've gone 2 years in New York. It's a terrific series, and it would not have happened without Capgemini getting behind this and really being their vision, their generosity in actually supporting this and co-hosting this whole thing. One of the things about this series, for those of you who are regulars, there's some regulars and many new faces here, which is good, is we're always grappling with the issues that are concerned to the region right now, the San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley, what's happening now with an eye towards the future. And so it would make, it's no coincidence that we've been grappling with the implications of AI and robotics over the course of these 4 years. We've had a lot of, we of course have a range of all kinds of different topics, but we've had quite a bit that has touched on this topic. It's been a couple years now since we had Ken Goldberg, who's a robotics expert at UC Berkeley, who kind of presented his kind of vision a couple years ago. Some of you might remember that one. He, by the way, is just finishing class and rushing here, and he's hoping to kind of catch the end of this and actually be part of this event as well. But actually last fall, we also had Kai-Fu Lee, one of the really Chinese, kind of the leading lights of thinking through AI from the Chinese perspective, and he had his new book called AI Superpowers, which we actually had, was kind of launching in the case of that last fall. And Kai-Fu Lee was extremely bullish on AI and extremely bullish on the current paradigm of AI, which is deep learning. And he, in fact, had a very controversial point of view in which he was positing that actually Chinese entrepreneurs and Chinese engineers were probably better positioned than American engineers and entrepreneurs to push the kind of existing paradigm of AI, deep learning, into all the nooks and crannies of the global economy, and that over time, China was actually in a better position than the United States, the American kind of economy, to actually take the most use of that. A bunch of reasons for that: access to big data, all kinds of things that are more difficult in the West. But he also said in that kind of framework, which was quite interesting, that the Chinese are good at that incremental innovation, but it really in the AI space, but the Americans are closer, or the Western countries are closer, much better positioned for the breakthrough ideas, the new paradigm shifts, the really ones that really are going to restructure the field if that's going to happen. And so we're going to pick up from that insight, honestly, today, and in the conversation we're going to do tonight, because what our speaker today is going to be kind of laying out, Gary Marcus, is that in fact there are for sure really constraints and limits to what following the pathway of deep learning could actually carry out. There's a ton of amazing applications, and it will have a big impact on the global economy. On the other hand, it's going to have there's limits to what it can do. And he starts to rough out in his new book, Rebooting AI, which, by the way, are going to be available after this for his signing, and you can buy them here. He really starts to rough out what is that, what's the shape of that next paradigm? What are we actually having to get to really get what he calls robust AI that we can all trust, and robust robotics that we can all trust? And so, like I say, he's the author of this new book that's come out, co-author. So we've got one of the authors here, but he's a perfect person to kind of position this. He's a cognitive psychologist. In fact, he has just recently become an emeritus professor at NYU after teaching there for many years. For the young guy, pretty young for an emeritus, in my opinion. But so he's kind of got the academic kind of side of things. He's also a very successful entrepreneur. He actually did actually was the founder of a startup that actually got bought by Uber in 2016, and in the deep learning space. And then he's now got a new company now called Robust AI that he's co-founded among others, Rodney Brooks, who is the kind of Roomba guy and who actually did so much to kind of open up robotics into everyday life. And he's also a best-selling author of other books, including Guitar Zero. And so he's good at communicating science ideas to larger audiences and broader audiences. So we are really lucky to have Gary here, really lucky to be listening to him, and really lucky to have a great conversation tonight. So to start, he's going to come up and explain his book a little bit with a little presentation. Then, as usual, I'll kind of come in and we'll have a little conversation, and we'll roll out to a conversation with you. But for this, let's welcome Gary.
Boy, I have a lot of friends in this room. It's kind of astonishing. It's sort of like the layers of my life. I have friends, including Michael, who's a professor at Berkeley, going back to well, we won't even talk about those things, but I was in college and he was in summer camp. And so thank you for coming, Michael, all the way up to people from Geometric Intelligence who are now at Uber. Somewhere over there is my CTO, Doug, who has more energy than any human being alive, but is not standing up and taking the applause. And people from my new company, we have about 4 people doing what Doug did by himself, but they're all very busy and awesome, and I thank them all for coming, and many other friends too. So it's kind of exciting to have you all here, and it means that I'm concerned that I might not do so well. I will try not to panic. Okay, so you probably already know the title of the book. Some people think AI really matters a lot and might really be fundamentally profound, and I sort of think they might be right in the long term. Here's Sundar. He's obviously got a vested interest in wanting you to think that AI is profound, since he has some of the largest collection of AI researchers in the world and large investments. And he says AI is one of the most important things that humanity is working on. It is more profound than, I don't know, electricity or fire. And in the long run, that may be right, but I'm here partly to, can we turn the level down just a tiny bit? I'm here to give a dose of realism about current reality. Some of you might have seen an op-ed that I had a week or so ago in the New York Times. And what we said and what we think is the central thing we need to be worrying about right now is that artificial intelligence has a trust problem right now. So there might be some future species of artificial intelligence that we can genuinely trust, and that's the aspiration of the book, is to point us in that direction. But right now we're relying on AI more and more, but it hasn't really earned our confidence yet. And there are lots of examples of that. And simultaneously, there's kind of a hype problem. So Andrew Ng, for example, is very well known in the deep learning community, the AI community. And he goes around sometimes saying things like this, that he really probably ought to know better than to say. He says, if a typical person can do a mental task with less than 1 second of thought, we can probably automate it using AI either now or in the near future. If that were true, then what Sundar said would be true. I mean, if we could really automate anything a person can do in a second, that would be amazing. And he wrote this in the Harvard Business Review, and it had a lot of impact. I don't think it's true. And there are lots of examples. Here's one example. Teslas have a routine almost problem of running into vehicles that are stopped on the side of the road. So this has happened at least by my count 5 times in the last year. 3 times it ran into Teslas that were on autopilot, or apparently on autopilot, ran into stopped fire trucks on the sides of highways. They've also run into tow trucks and I think police vehicles. This is an example of where maybe there's too much trust being placed in an AI system. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working on driverless cars, but it means we shouldn't yet trust them. Here's another example of a robot that was supposed to be taking care of security, but it kind of failed on its own security and took a swim. And there are other problems. I'm not going to talk about all the problems with AI tonight, although I'll talk about a bunch. This one I will just touch on briefly, which is a kind of bias problem. It's an interesting bias problem. It's not that the programmers at Google are biased against people that aren't white males, for example, but if you type in something like professor into Google image search, you're going to get a lot of white males, more than the actual number of white males in professors in American universities, which itself is going to be higher than if you looked at a university in Africa or something like that. And the problem is a kind of version of garbage in, garbage out that the AI systems are basically blindly devoted to whatever random sample of data that they get. So in statistical terms, Google image search is taking a convenience sample, and convenience is a polite way of saying a lazy sample. So you're just taking what's at hand, what happens to be labeled on the internet, and it can lead you to things that, for example, perpetuate bias. Not a good thing, a reason not to trust the machines. The thing that I'm mostly going to focus on today is a kind of brittleness in deep learning, which is by far the leading technique right now. Before I do that, I want to say that deep learning is good for a lot of things. A lot of people hear me saying we should throw deep learning away. This is not at all what I am saying. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. I think it has plenty of applications. So object recognition, for example, deep learning is not perfect at it. I'll show you some problems, but it's not bad. If you want to have a system recognize a bottle or a laptop or something like that, based on a lot of labeled examples, it works pretty well. Face recognition, speech recognition, recognizing patterns in board games, eventually radiology, we're already getting close. There are lots of places where deep learning is interesting. There are things you couldn't really do without deep learning, like you can colorize old black and white films to some degree, and there's just no other technique that could possibly do that. But I want to point out that these are all essentially examples of one aspect of intelligence. And I guess the subtext I haven't made explicit is I'm interested in how we make machines that are generally intelligent as opposed to just doing single narrow tasks. So all of these tasks are what I would call perceptual classification. I'm going to suggest that even there are problems, but that's kind of the core power of deep learning. I'm also going to suggest that we need to go beyond it. So I wrote a paper in 2018 that aggravated a lot of people in the field of deep learning called Deep Learning: A Critical Appraisal. You can read it on arXiv for free. There's in some sense a longer version in chapter 3 of the new book. And Jason Ponton had a nice summary of it that's easy to remember in Wired. He said, greedy, brittle, opaque, and shallow, the downsides to deep learning. So I actually went through a list of 10, but those are some of the important ones. What greedy means is you need a lot of data, and if you don't have really a whole lot of data that's very relevant, you're in trouble. And in fact, that leads to my paraphrase of Andrew Ng. So if you are consulting for a business or using AI in your business, you might want to keep this in mind. This is a more realistic version of what Andrew Ng had to say, which is if a typical person can do a mental task with less than 1 second of thought, and we can gather an enormous amount of directly relevant data, we have a fighting chance. So long as the test data, so you get trained on something, then tested on something, and so long as the test data aren't too terribly different from the training data and the domain doesn't change too much over time. So there are some things that fit perfectly into this rather less optimistic version, like board games. So a board game like Go or chess, well, the rules haven't changed in 2,000 years. That's about as stable over time as anything in humanity is going to get. And you can get as much data as you want. So there's an old technique going back to the 50s, I guess. Barney could tell me if I'm wrong. But I think Arthur Samuel did this in the 50s. You can play checkers by yourself, or you can play Go or chess by yourself. You can do it as much as you want. If you have Google's clusters, you can get essentially infinite amounts of training data. And you have a simulation that is the game itself. So when you play Go on your machine by yourself, you can assume that it's like Go in the actual world, because that's all there is. You can't do that for driving. So people are working on simulators that are intended to be just like the real world, but they invariably aren't. So even driving doesn't really fit in here all that well, because you get test data that are different from the training data, which is to say you may train your model on highway driving where all the cars are moving, and then you have a situation where the cars aren't moving because there's an emergency. Maybe that's outside your data set. These techniques don't work that well. And driving isn't even in the space of human kind of cognitive flexibility the most impressive thing, but it's already outside the scope of at least what we can do currently. Here's how it works when it works. So you get a bunch of labeled data. You see a bunch of pictures of Tiger Woods, and you get labels. You say, this is Tiger Woods. You get some pictures of golf balls. You get labels of that. You get pictures of Angelina Jolie. And now I show you a new picture that's similar to most of the pictures of Tiger Woods that you've seen before. And the system says, with some high probability, this is Tiger Woods. It's a fictional example, but there are lots of real examples like this. You use something. Do I have a laser pointer here? It doesn't work very well, though. So in the top right is a picture of something called a neural network. I imagine most people in this room have seen these kind of things before. You take as input some set of pixels, you get as output some labels. You try to approximate them over time. For now, it suffices to say it's a way of taking big data and forming statistical approximations. And as long as the things you're tested on are familiar, it does pretty well. But people kind of got a little overexcited about this. Starting around 2012, I took a representative example from Wired, which said deep learning will soon give us super smart robots. Well, many of my friends who are here today are trying to help me build super smart robots. Deep learning will be part of the solution, but I think we will all agree that it is not the solution, and certainly those super smart robots that we were promised, like Rosie the robot who could solve all our problems, have not yet arrived. And once the data don't look like what you're trained on, all bets are off. So here are some typical examples on that side of the screen of elephants that might be a deep learning system might be trained on. And then you can give a picture that is outside the range of things that is seen before. And it will very likely fall apart. So we took, I think, Amazon's recognition system, fed this picture in. It's a silhouette. There's not that many silhouettes in the data. How many people think that this is a person? Raise your hand. Okay, so there were no AIs in listening to the talk right now. I just wanted to make sure. That was a CAPTCHA test. You all passed, although I shouldn't have let you get away with being quiet. So probably most of you don't think it's a person. Most of you probably think it's an elephant. So you can adapt. You can realize that it's a silhouette, and that the texture that you were expecting on an elephant isn't there. Deep learning systems actually rely a lot on texture. I'll give you some examples in a minute. They don't understand conceptually that an elephant has a trunk. And there are some people trying to work on this and so forth. But the basic version of deep learning doesn't recognize that kind of stuff. Here's another example. Deep learning says with great confidence that this is a snowplow. It is not, in fact, a snowplow. It does not, in fact, even have a plow. Again, if you analyze the parts, some are missing. What it does have and why it gets recognized as a snowplow is it has the kind of snowy, curvy road that are probably in a lot of labeled pictures of snowplows. So this is what I mean about misunderstanding the texture. And another example is some people at MIT made 3D baseballs with foam on them. And the deep learning system was pretty confident that those were espressos. The texture is right, but sports fans know better. Here's yet another example. You can take a psychedelic sticker of a toaster, you put it next to a banana, and a deep learning system will tell you confidently that it's a toaster. Deep learning systems, as they are typically constructed, don't even have the possibility of saying something more subtle, like it's a banana that is near a psychedelic sticker of a toaster, right? Usually, it's a forced choice, so either it can say toaster or banana or one of these other categories, and as far as it's concerned, toaster, which is kind of like has high contrast and stuff like that, is the right answer. Here's another one. There was a New York Times article about captioning. There was suddenly a database where people could train deep learning systems on things like a group of kids playing Frisbee, and it would spit back a group of kids playing Frisbee, and everybody was wowed and amazed. But if you looked at the back of the article, there were also cases like this. This is a parking sign with stickers on it. I'm going to assume that you humans can discern that. But there was a kind of Oliver Sacks-style response. You know, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. A refrigerator filled with lots of food and drinks is what the deep learning system did. As Sacks would have told you, you get an answer like that, you should bring your patient to the neurologist. Here's another example. Deep learning can probably tell you that there's a barbell here, and it can probably tell you that it's a dog, depending on the data set. The ears might fool it and might not. But it is not going to be able to look at the scene as a whole. So you can look at the scene as a whole and say, wow, how did the dog get so ripped that it could lift that barbell? Right? So you can understand the nature of the scene as a whole, and deep learning systems can't do that. And these things just keep going on and on. So some people in the room will know Benedict Evidence from A16Z. He posted this yesterday, and you can decide how you would caption that image. My friend David Ha put it through ImageNet classifier. This came out today, and he got flamingo and griffin and photocopier and et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that was just today. Like, it goes on and on. It's not like these things have been solved. Or somebody just sent me this. It's not the most attractive picture of me ever, but I was talking about driverless cars in a podcast, and I mentioned, I should have covered this up so people, anyway, I said Chris Urmson used to be at Waymo, and then I described this fun video that he put together while he was at Waymo, and it came out with the automatic captioning, which is also something deep learning does reasonably well, as Chris Urmson used to be a lame-o. Chris, I didn't mean it. Okay. Current AI is actually even more out of its depth when in reading. So, like, I try to frame the argument on its own turf. Vision is where it's at its best. When you get to language, it's not even in the game. And one of the reasons we wrote this book is to show just how deeply there's a mismatch between deep learning and what really goes on in human cognition. So to do this, we went through a bunch of worked examples. I'm just going to give you one of them tonight. This one was a children's story written by Laura Ingalls Wilder, as many of you know from The Little House on the Prairie. And it's a story about a little boy who finds a wallet, which back in that day was called a pocketbook, and it's full of money, finds it on the street. His father guesses who that pocketbook/wallet belongs to, which is a Mr. Thompson. Almanzo finds Mr. Thompson in one of the stores in town, and then there's this bit of dialogue. Almanzo, or text. Almanzo turns to Mr. Thompson and asks, "Did you lose a pocketbook?" Mr. Thompson jumps. He slapped a hand to his pocket and fairly shouted, "Yes, I have. $1,500 in it, too. What about it? What do you know about it?" "Is this it?" Almanzo asked. Yes, that's it," Mr. Thompson said, snatching the pocketbook. He opened it and hurriedly counted the money. He counted all the bills over twice. Then he breathed a long sigh of relief and said, "Well, this Dern boy didn't steal any of it." So there's a lot of things that you do automatically when you read a text like this. So one is, you could tell me, for example, how much money Mr. Thompson actually counted. That's not actually said in the text, but you infer it from the amount of money that was there and the fact that it's all still in the wallet. Or you could tell me, why did he slap his pocket? And it's because you know that if your hand reaches your butt, then there's not something that should have been there that's in your pocket, right? So you have all this background knowledge about physical objects and how people behave. If some of the money was not there, then you can imagine that Mr. Thompson would have had a different reaction. So you do psychological reasoning, physical reasoning, right? What if Mr. Thompson found that there was only $700? He'd probably be a little bit more upset. So you can make all of these kinds of inferences. Current deep learning systems just don't do that at all. The closest we could find to even test this was, I kind of already made that point, a very, quote, dangerous system. I'm making fun of OpenAI. Someone on OpenAI reserved on the guest list and may want to beat me up afterwards, but OpenAI released this thing called GPT-2. And when they released it, this is an article from The Guardian in February, they said it might be too dangerous, when they announced it, I should have said that more carefully. When they announced the system, they said it might be too dangerous to to foist on humanity. And what this system does is it takes a few sentences and then it extends them. So you can it's an ultimate fill in the blanks, I guess, in a way, except that it's actually incoherent. So we fed in the same story that I told you about, and this is the output we got. So after he's counted the wallet, he's so happy he's got all his money back, the system says it took a lot of time, maybe hours, for him to get the money from the safe place where he hid it, so he brought it back in a bundle and left it on the table. Like, it just makes no sense. It's perfectly grammatical, but if he just found his wallet, then what is going on with the safe place and so forth? And there's an answer. It's not kind of random or mathematically ill-defined, but it's an example of putting statistics over coherence and semantic understanding. So the statistics are that wallets in safe places are well, I'm speculating, but my speculation is the reason that it did this is because wallets in safe places are statistically correlated. It's not keeping track of what happened when. If you watch the systems a lot, you will see that like things wink in and out of existence and so forth. There's no common sense about the nature of reality. Fluent but incoherent, you can try this later at talktotransformer.com. We had a little bit of back and forth at my company after I published this example in Wired, and people had all kinds of craziness come out of the system. Okay, so the second part of the talk and the second part of the book is mostly about what the cognitive sciences might tell us about how to do better. So again, I'm not saying we need to just jettison deep learning, but I'm saying it's not going to work by itself. And that takes me to the first lesson, which is I think people need to stop looking for silver bullets. And they've been doing that in AI. They've been doing it in psychology, probably many other domains. You could argue in a certain sense that goes on in physics. The physics is out of my domain, but the cognitive science is not. So that's how I was trained before I started working in AI. And from a cognitive science perspective, what deep learning is good at is a piece of perception. I've shown you that even in perception, it's got its limits. It's not really about common sense, planning, analogy, language, reasoning, all these other things that are part of anything that we'd want to call general intelligence. And I'm going to highlight something from this article that I wrote in Archive because I think people keep misrepresenting me as a way of trying to make me go away. So the head of AI at Facebook, for example, is very indignant that I should be attacking his baby, I think. And so I don't think he's read this piece, and I want to highlight it, which is, I said, despite all the problems I've sketched, I don't think we need to abandon deep learning. Rather, we need to reconceptualize it, not as a universal solvent, but it simply as one tool among many, a power screwdriver in a world where we also need hammers, wrenches, and pliers, not to mention chisels, drills, voltmeters, logic probes, and oscilloscopes. So the point here is not let's throw away deep learning, but let's not assume that it's the whole pie of intelligence either. And some of the uses that people put to deep learning to are fine and some are not. It comes back partly to the issue of trust. If you want to use deep learning to do perception in a narrow domain where the rules are always the same, it's fine. If you want to use deep learning end-to-end, as they talk about nowadays for driving, it's probably not fine. All right. That brings me to common sense, and I'll just give you a few examples. We can talk about why common sense is actually hard to define, but I'll kind of illustrate some examples. One is this robot is cutting down a tree limb, but those who know something about trees and cutting and so forth will realize that the robot is about to make a terrible mistake. Now, AlphaGo, the world's greatest Go player, was trained by playing millions of games and making lots and lots of mistakes. You would not want the robot to be trained by making lots and lots of mistakes, cutting down lots and lots of tree limbs from the wrong side, right? There'd be a lot of bystanders would be killed or maimed and so forth. So you want to be able to understand something like this with the minimal amount of error by having some background knowledge about how things work. Here's another example. Yesterday I had the pleasure of giving this talk to the only person I know who knows what this is. Maybe somebody in the crowd will know. You can find them on Etsy. They're called yarn feeders. Or she had another name, yarn bowl. And as soon as I show it to you and tell you what it is, you can figure out its function, which is something deep learning does not represent. And its function is obviously to hold the yarn in while you pull, the bulk of the yarn while you pull a little bit of it out. And then once you know that, you can recognize another one and identify how it works, even if every pixel in the image is different, right? Deep learning is typically staying at the pixel level. Even if every pixel is different and it's butt ugly, right? You can still recognize that as a yarn feeder. All right, here's another example that we talked about in the New York Times op-ed and in the book at some length, which is the everyday grader. So we talk about the importance of having representations of things like space and time and causality. So grader is actually part of space. You have to represent the physical nature of the grader in space, and you have to understand something about causality in order to use it. So a deep learning system can easily learn to recognize a grader, and people who build computer games know how to build 3D representations of graders. So if you wanted to make a video game where there was a giant grader and the flying drones that went through the holes and you wanted to do collision detection, you could do that with current technologies. But what we don't yet have a technology for is to understand like why there's a handle on top, or why some of the circles are sharp, or why some of the circles are smaller than others, right? It will be a major advance when robots really do have that level of functional knowledge. Right now, we don't really even have tools for properly representing these things in our systems. Here's one more example of common sense. This is a Roomba. Rodney, my co-founder, has been very gracious in not telling me to get rid of this slide. But here's a Roomba. It doesn't know the difference between, let's say, Nutella and dog waste, and sometimes that leads to a problem, which is called the poopocalypse. As a journalist, I wanted to check out whether this was true. So there's a Facebook thing, somebody wrote about it, and it was like, yeah, this is almost too good from the perspective of someone lampooning AI to actually be true. And so I checked it out, and in fact, not only has this happened once, but it actually happens a lot. There's actually a company policy about what to do in the event of a poopocalypse, which short version is you give them a new Roomba because you don't want to be cleaning that. Okay. We already saw this as an example of a lack of common sense. Third thing that we actually give a list of 11 in the book, but I'm just giving you a few now. Deep learning, number crunching, big data, that's part of learning, but learning is actually a rich panoply of different kinds of mechanisms. So you think about like ducklings imprinting on the first thing that they see. There's imprinting, there's calibration, there are many, many different kinds of learning. I'm going to illustrate learning through exploration. This is my daughter, Chloe. This was taken about a year ago when she was 4 years old. We were sitting in Whole Foods and she saw a chair. So it's learning by exploration, it's problem solving and intuitive understanding of how the world works. She's not doing imitation here. She decides that she wants to climb through the chair. I couldn't do that. Even if I was at my most trim, I would not fit through the chair. Her older brother didn't do it, and she did not. For those who are interested, watch The Dukes of Hazzard. Anyway, for those who know what that is. So, she set herself a goal, And people are looking at this in AI, kind of intrinsic goal setting, but I would say my kids are way better at intrinsic goal setting than any AI system we currently have. In fact, I also have an older child. She's 5 now, my son is 6.5. And basically, they set goals for each other all day long. They make games. They're like, what if you had the superpower that you could fly? And how, what would follow if this were true or that were true? When they were younger, they were like, let's see if I can walk on this ledge. They're just constantly setting new goals. My daughter was like trying to see if she could ride on her legs were long enough now to ride on the pedal trailer on the bicycle that we have. She's constantly setting new goals. And so here she was setting the goal of climbing through the chair. And I should say I didn't have the presence of mind to record this the first time that she did it, but I thought it was so amazing I recorded it the second. So this is a reenactment, second time that she did it. And she actually got stuck. So there was some feedback and some trial and error, but it wasn't 10 million trials. It was about 30 seconds, and she figured, oh, well, if I rotate my head, then I can get through, and she did. This takes me to Liz Spelke, who's made, I think, a great argument about cognitive development that in some ways she's adapted from Noam Chomsky and Immanuel Kant before that. So Kant's argument, which we extend, is that you need to be born with things like space, time, and causality. I mean, I'm psychologizing the way that Kant put it. Spelke puts it more directly, and it follows in the Chomskyan tradition, right? Chomsky's argument is language is too vast to be captured by statistics alone. You need some innate support in order to be able to learn language. Spelke makes the same argument with respect to kind of our cognition of the world, that we need to be born with the ability to perceive objects, person sets, and places. If you have that as a bedrock, then you can learn a whole bunch of other stuff, but you need to start there. This is, a nativist argument. For the most part, right now, AI is in a place where nativism is treated as cheating, although there was a very interesting Twitter thread today about this very topic, and I feel like things are moving. But when I wrote about this a year ago, Tom Diederich, who's one of the famous people in the field, basically said that innateness is like cheating, right? You don't learn everything from your system. He actually said something very different today, which was intriguing. Anyway, people never believe, actually, let me go back for 1 second. People often have trouble thinking that other human beings have innate knowledge. They're perfectly comfortable thinking that their kids have temperament. They know that their son is different from their daughter, but they really resent the notion that there's any innate knowledge. Chomsky has been attacked for his entire career for making this kind of point. Pinker has been attacked for it. And so I've given up trying to persuade you all that humans have a lot of innateness. I'm very sure they do. We can talk about it. But I have decided that it's instead better to show you a baby ibex.
All it can do is wait for one to slip and fall.
To do what the baby ibex is doing, there has to be innate structure, right? This is like an hour or a day after it's born, and it's climbing down the side of the mountain. The only way that you can do that is if you have some innate sense of three-dimensional geometry, of mountains, of your own physical capabilities, of how to jump. All there built in.
And they're now almost
doesn't mean that the ibex can't learn anything, but there's a lot there to start. Of course, it evolved over time. It didn't come there by magic. But there's plenty of innate structure. And in kind of fairness and in comparison, what's amazing about this video, and that not everybody knows, even if they've seen it already on the internet, is that everything in this video was actually announced in advance. What the tasks were was part of a DARPA competition. And people did all of these things in simulation. And then they came to the real world, and this is an example of brittleness. It's not necessarily all deep learning, but it's kind of the state of the art that we don't have enough innate structure and they don't do so well. So let me recap and also start by giving you a few words of advice. I know there are a lot of people that are really worried about robots taking over the world. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, given the state of AI, and I don't think they have any motivation whatsoever to do it. So I'm not actually worried about that. I'm much more worried about the misuse of contemporary AI with all its limits. But just in case you are worried, I'm going to give you some practical advice. So in the event of a robot attack, number one, close the door. Robots are really not that good with doorknobs. Since I wrote this sentence, somebody released a database of doorknobs, and so maybe there'll be some progress. But if things get really rough, lock it. You know, it's like a 10-year project to like get robots to jiggle the door when it's a little tight and the striker's not quite right. Or hide behind a bus, or dress like a bus, or hide behind a shiny toaster, or keep a pack of psychedelic stickers on hand, have a giant fan, have something handy that's slimy or silly, some jacks or banana peels, or just talk in a noisy room with a foreign accent. They will never understand what it is you have in mind. Or in the worst case, climb some stairs or a tree or something like that. You'll be fine. All right. Second, deep learning is a better ladder. This is not me originally. It's an old metaphor, but I think it's right. It applies here. Deep learning is a better ladder, but a better ladder doesn't necessarily get you to the moon. To do that entire pie chart, not just the perception, but the reasoning, the language, the attention, all of these things that go into cognition is like doing a moonshot. It's not like building a better ladder. We can use that ladder for lots of things, but that's not going to be enough. Another way to put it is just deep learning is no substitute for deep understanding. We really need to build systems that have mental models of the world, of the objects and the people in them that have psychological and physical reasoning. And just compiling a lot of statistics from big data is not enough to do that. So if we want to build machines that are as smart as people, I think what we should do is to start by studying small people. I thank you very much. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Great, great. Wait, why don't you sit over there? And, oh, folks, where do you go here? I'm sure you've got a lot of your own thinking here, your own questions. I'm going to go in here because I read the book, and I encourage you all to get the book, which I could say afterwards. We'll have these on sale, and you can get your own version of it. But you did a really good layout of just how almost kind of absurd at some level the issue is here, at some level of how far we're away on this. But what do you make then of the sense of folks that actually are so incredibly bullish on this and are so kind of just optimistic about how we've kind of crossed a new threshold into AI, and also those that are so confident that within a relatively short amount of time we'll get to general intelligence? I mean, what do you make of that?
I think there's a lot of different reasons why there's irrational exuberance, to borrow a phrase. I think some of the exuberance comes from a human tendency to do what I guess the Romans or the Greeks called the fallacy of the composition. You see something in one place and you think it will kind of extend arbitrarily. And we've seen this in AI going back to almost the beginning. So how many people have heard of ELIZA in the 1960s? So ELIZA was a chat bot that was basically a psychologist. And it was really, really dumb. What it did is it looked for keywords like mother, and if it saw a keyword like mother, it would say, tell me more about your family. And some people talked to it over a teletype, which is like text messaging in the 1960s, and they thought they were talking to a real person, so they were gullible. They thought, if I see some sign of intelligence, there must be a genuine intelligence there. And so part of it is, a layperson doesn't understand all the things that go into intelligence. They'll take a small sample of intelligence and extrapolate wildly from it and think there's general intelligence there when it's not. So that's one side of it. Another side is follow the money, right? I mean, you know, people have huge investments in it, and they want those investments to pay off. Another thing is I think that a lot of people treat AI as magic. So if you don't actually code for a living, then it's easy to imagine, if it works some of the time, that, wow, I mean, some of the stuff it does is genuinely incredible. Colorizing old films is incredible. And it's possible to just assimilate that to a general notion of magic, right? You know the Arthur C. Clarke line about any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But if you actually code, as many of my friends in this room do, you realize very quickly that it's not magic, and that, you know, it works some of the time and not other times, and there's special cases you have to handle, and there's a sort of unending periphery of edge cases that are hard to deal with. You realize that it's not magic. You also realize there's a lot of different techniques. So, you know, a good AI researcher knows many different algorithms and uses them in different places. But if you're the general public, you read these books about like AI and ethics or something like that, and AI is just described in this very undifferentiated form. And I mean, you know, we wrote this to try to break people out of that, but you know, the media doesn't help, because the media tends to paint AI with a very broad brush. Nobody wants to go into the details of like data augmentation or, you know, edge cases or whatever. And so people lose the texture of what's really going on in the field. And the other thing that we were really pushing hard on the book was to show this, I said this once before, but the fundamental mismatch between the problems that deep learning is good at and what really needs to be solved in cognition. It's very hard to do that in anything less than book length. And mostly people read op-eds or talk to their friends over drinks, and you just don't get the richness of how far away we really are.
So I mentioned Kai-Fu Lee here last fall, and he had an argument around, as I mentioned, kind of just pushing through the applications of deep learning into all its logical extension. But he did set up this idea that, we had this breakthrough in deep learning, and granted, he didn't necessarily say it's going to cover everything. But what do we need? I mean, you kind of set this general agenda. Hey, we got to figure out common sense, or we got to figure out planning and that stuff. I mean, but in a kind of more kind of grounded sense, like, do we need some kind of theoretical breakthroughs here that are going to almost be randomly come across? Are we at a place where we've got to set moonshot agendas with kind of research money behind it? I mean, I'm just curious. What do we need to kind of start to figure this out?
If I were king, as my president believes that he is, what I would do is to set up a very well-funded interdisciplinary research institute, multinational. I wrote an op-ed about this once, a CERN for AI, with the target of reading. I think that if you could get machines to read, it would transform the world. And if you had a very specific target, and your target was not, let's sell more ads this week, but this foundational problem, I think that would help make advances. Now, I am not king, and so I have done the closest thing that I can think of to that, which is to try to set up a company to work on robotics, where I think one can make incremental progress. I think the problem's not quite as hard to make some pretty nice advances, and one can work through some of this. I mean, most importantly, the name of the company is Robust AI. Work on how do you make AI robust? So it's all very well and good if you're placing ads to have your AI work like 70% of the time or something. If I recommend to you one book and you like this book and then you don't like the other book, you like my book Guitar Zero and you hate this one, you wasted $30 is not the end of the world. But if we're building, let's say, an elder care robot and it lifts grandpa into bed 9 times out of 10, that's not going to cut it. And so it's exciting to work in an area where the AI really has to be good, where it can't be just sort of approximative. The thing about deep learning is there's a reason it works as well as it does, which is that the statistics that it's glomming onto are proxies for things in the real world, but they're not the real world itself. And so, like, there is a proxy for what a snowplow is, which is, this pattern of white and black and so forth. Deep learning is great at picking up on those proxies, but doesn't get at the real thing. So in a robotics company, we're forced to go closer to the thing in itself and not just kind of muck around with the statistics of what to me seem like shadows of the real thing.
So this reading project, let's just take that for example. Would that be comparable to like the Human Genome Project or something, where you'd have these kind of international efforts to crack this thing, and if we crack it, then everything spills out of it? In fact, we had Linda Avey here last event we had here, where just cracking that, and then she's the founder of 23andMe. Just all kinds of things would spill out of it. So some giant goal. Well, how realizable is it, and how kind of possible it is? And if it does hit that, though, you seem to feel like that would kind of rain all kinds of different applications.
I think it'd be huge applications. I mean, in fact, I think it'd be harder than the Genome Project, first of all. So the Genome Project, everybody knew what needed to be done. The question was, how do you accelerate that? How do you do it faster and cheaper? But at least it was a very clearly defined target. Reading is not as clearly defined, and it's not as clear what the right technologies are. So it's harder in that sense. I'd argue the payoff might actually, in the medium term, be greater. So the Genome Project hasn't led to that much tangible medical application yet. I mean, it's getting better and better, but it's not what people thought it would be. I mean, the genome was the first draft was 2001. I remember the San Francisco Chronicle was humans survive on fewer genes than thought. Like, people had no idea what to make of the results when they got them, and they kind of ran around looking for implications. If we had a machine that could read, it could transform medicine. So one of the biggest problems we have right now, I think technologically, is that we can't assimilate the medical literature as fast as it's produced. So I saw a statistic, something like 7,000 papers are published a day. This is a job for a computer, but it's not a job for the computers we have now. It's a job for computers that can read, right? Not to put a fine point on it, but machines right now are illiterate, right? If we could get literate machines that can understand the medical literature because they have a richer representation of how biology works, then they could do something people can't, which is to integrate all of the many molecules that are involved in all of the many papers that are written. That would be transformative. Like, you think about like how little progress we've made on Alzheimer's, in or depression. Like there's very few new drugs in the last 35 years. Like there is stuff in the medical literature that maybe would be useful, but it's locked in there because machines can't read. And the same I think for technology. So climate change. There's probably lots of stuff that's in the literature, but we're not leveraging it as well as we can. It'd be nice to have machines to help us to do that. And in that way, it's a harder problem, but the payoff could be just immense.
Just given that you know a heck of a lot more than most people in this room, including me, how confident are you that we will get to that? And if so, how long do you think it'll take to get to that kind of point?
Well,
I mean, a lot of variables, obviously, but just
we will get to that point. So,
you will get to that, okay.
Some people have assimilated me to a guy named Bert Dreyfus, who I think argued that we would never get to AI. And that's not my argument at all. I think we will get there. The last chapter of the book is about what the world might be like if we had an AI that we could actually trust, that did have common sense, that had values. And that's actually a very optimistic chapter, which throws people a lot for a loop because the rest of the book is not so optimistic. But we do think that we're going to get there. However, how quickly we get there is a function of what research strategy we take, among other things. And right now, the research strategy is mostly let's mine deep learning for more and more stuff by getting bigger data sets and curating those data sets more carefully. And I think that distracts away from the harder problems. So in the field, people sometimes talk about a local minimum. I think the field is stuck in a local minimum. Like, we're getting a lot of mileage out of it. And if I were running Google, I might want to do the same thing. Like if my biggest asset was my data, I would probably be thinking about AI in that way. But there's a lot of AI that comes from better handling smaller amounts of data in the way that children do. It's a harder problem. I think it's going to require, for example, hand coding some knowledge. And people are allergic to that because the last big effort to do that was Doug Lennett's Psych, and it didn't seem to succeed as well as he had hoped. And so there's an allergy in the field to even trying to spend a lot of work hand coding stuff. I keep thinking of this Bertrand Russell quote, which is all the advantages of theft over honest toil. Like, it's so much easier to just put in a big data set, be careful about that, and hope that you get the right answer than to think through carefully, like, what are all the inferences that people make about a container, which is something Ernie Davis, with a little bit of help from me, did. We have an article in Journal of Artificial Intelligence, or AI Journal, that's like 150 axioms in order to make some basic inferences about like what goes into a container and what will stay in a container. It's like incredibly boring and tedious work. The only person who's read it really, really carefully is Ernie. I tried, but I don't have that kind of mind, and nobody else probably has read it.
Yep.
Ernie's co-author of the book,
Yep.
but also of this particular article that I'm talking about containers. And like, if the answer turned out to be that, like all the people who are doing deep learning would just be like depressed and like, it's just not what they want the answer to be. And maybe it isn't, and maybe it's something in between. And we don't claim that we actually have the answer, but we make an argument that you need, for example, logic in some part of the system, which deep learning doesn't do particularly well. And you might need it for parts of physical reasoning. You might do parts of it with simulation, you might do parts of it with logic. And it's just not a part of people's intellectual taste. So going back to your question, like, when are we going to get to reading? Well, you can't get to reading really until you can do physical reasoning, psychological reasoning, spatial reasoning, etc. And I think to do that, we need a different approach than the one that is popular right now. And so then it's a question of like, when do people say, hey, this looked really great, but it doesn't quite take us as far as we want? That's happened before in history. It happened, for example, with Shannon and information theory, right? Everybody thought that was going to solve everything. That should have been on my silver bullet slide. And it didn't. I mean, it's really useful. And I mean, there are some domains where it's totally reshaped things, and other domains, Shannon's information theory hasn't had that much influence on AI. There's some offshoots, and there's some value there. But Shannon's information theory was simply stated, seemed magical, and I won't say it died, but it receded. Nobody builds their driverless car just by counting bits of information or something like that. Eventually, I think people will realize that my skepticism is actually not just because I want attention, but because I want the field to do better, and that maybe the field would do better going in a different direction. In fact, since I wrote that article in January of 2018, and there was hundreds of tweets basically saying what a horrible person I was, the field has actually changed some, and there is, I think, more hunger now to find something different. And certainly in my company, it hasn't been a hard sell to get a team of amazing people very quickly who are all, some are sitting in the front row, all of whom are committed to deep learning as a tool, but let's find some other tools too.
Can you say a little bit more? We're going to do a few more questions here, but just be thinking about your own questions about what he said and what we're kind of doing here. Say more about what your company. Can you talk a little bit more? Like you're taking a piece of this kind of monster problem, and you're taking a piece of it and trying. Can you say a little bit more about how it came out of it? Did it come out of the book?
I was about to say that. It actually came out of the book. So there was a chapter on reading that I gave you a little teaser of today. And in the chapter on reading, we try to show, look, this is just not the right solution to the problem. And then we were like, what's another good case study for this? And I think Ernie actually wrote the first draft of the robots chapter, but we do everything very interactively. By the end, you can't sort of tell who's which. And the company came out of this chapter in two different ways. So we wrote a chapter about robots, talking about all the ways in which the current techniques just aren't going to get us to Rosie the robot. So everybody knows Rosie the robot from the Jetsons, a kind of domestic robot that can take care of your kids and clean the counters and all this kind of stuff. And I have two little kids. I would pay $1 million for Rosie the robot if I could get one that I could trust. I wouldn't pay nothing for anything that's commercially available right now because I can't trust any of it. I'm not going to put it around my kids. But anyway, so I wrote this chapter, and I realized that it's such a perfect test case for pushing AI harder. What I ultimately care about is not money, although I care some about it, but it's really like, how do we push the field forward to really approach general intelligence rather than just doing all this statistical calculation? And so one of the ways that the company came out of this book is that chapter made me think, wow, this is an amazing problem. Not enough people are working on it in the right way at all. The typical robot company is like doing something very narrow, possibly useful, like building or excavating the foundation for a construction company, or picking apples. And then you talk to the apple picking guy, and he's like, you ask him, what about peaches? And he gives you a long pause. Like it's an apple picking company. It's not a fruit picking company. Or it's an excavation company. It's not a construction company. So I thought, with all that narrowness, and Barney and I have had endless arguments about whether this is a good idea, with all that narrowness, if you could build something that was more flexible, could work in the dynamic, open-ended world, like a home or a construction site that's constantly changing, that would just totally change the world. One of our DEX slides, when we were raising money, said robotics right now is a $25 or $50 million a year industry, billion dollar a year industry, excuse me, locked inside of what could be a $500 billion a year industry. I mean, imagine if we could have robots that were as flexible as Rosie, how useful that would be in so many different domains. You could do package delivery to the door, and you could have fire rescue, and pull people out of all kinds of dangerous jobs, and it'd be amazing. So, okay, that's part one. The second part of the story is, so I send this chapter to Rodney Brooks, who I knew a little bit at this point. I've been teasing him for years. He and my son share a birthday, and I met him just before my son was born, and so it turned out that my son was born on his due date, Rod's birthday. So every year I would send Rod an email saying something like, "Happy birthday! My son just turned 2. He's climbing couches. Can your robots do that?" He had a pretty good sense of humor. And then when my son was 4, I decided that there was just no comparison anymore. I stopped sending Rod those emails. But he was kind enough to look at the chapter, and he said that this incredibly mean chapter that said, robots really aren't working that well, he said it was way too nice. And so he gave some feedback on the chapter, but also the way he answered that chapter had a hint. And I read the hint correctly. I was joking about how poor my social cognition is, but in this case it worked. And I realized that he was about to be loose. I could just tell in the Silicon Valley sense of loose, like that he might be available for something new. And so I was already working with Mohammed, who's somewhere in the crowd over here, and said, I think Rod might join us, and wouldn't that be amazing? And then I spent like 3 or 4 months courting him. Somebody famous, I don't remember who it is, might have been Steve Jobs, is the kind of thing that gets attributed to Jobs, said, anytime I want somebody really good, it's really hard because they already have infinite opportunity. And a week later, it became clear that Rod's company was going out of business, but I had already started the conversation, so I was there at the right time. And then it took a long time to convince him that we had something real. I'm going to say what that something is in a second. But he was kind of hooked immediately. He saw that this was interesting, so even though he had all these other opportunities, he kept talking to me, and we eventually kind of, and with Mohammed, figured out what we were going to do. And the basic idea of what we want to do is really to build what we call a cognitive engine. So, there's already something called an operating system for robots called ROS. Nobody likes it, but everybody uses it. It's like democracy. It's the best of the available options. And people are miserable with it, but they use it. But it's very low level. So it's about things like how you pass messages and how you do low-level control of the motors and stuff like that. But there's nothing out there that gives robots situational awareness or a good general ability to predict the consequences of their own actions, anything like that. Anything that fits in what I would call cognition, right? There is no cognitive engine that you can buy, license, rent, steal. There just isn't one. And there's certainly nothing that does this at a kind of industrial grade. So there's some academic projects and so forth. Nobody has built this in a way that you could actually use and license. So you can think about like a game engine. The purpose of a game engine is to save you all the work so you can focus on the thing you actually want to build. You can think about the art and the dynamic and so forth. We want people who are developing apps for robots, essentially, to have a set of tools so they don't have to worry about whether the robot's going to put a cat in the dishwasher, because it already understands that cats don't like going in dishwashers and people like their cats and don't want their cats to be ruined and so forth. So there should be enough background knowledge and understanding such that a robot can deal with an ever-changing world, and you can just write your app on top of it. That's the goal.
When do we get it?
We have a running joke in the company. We're working on a demo, and I told them this old joke. So we're trying to figure out the timing, and I keep trying to make it a little bit tighter. And the old joke is somebody says to their father, boy says to his father, "Can I borrow $50?" And father says, "$40? What do you want $30 for? Take this 20." So what do we agree on next week for the demo?
All right, we're ready for that. Folks, there's so many interesting characters in the audience here, and I've been monopolizing the time here, and so let's switch to talking to the audience, and I am going to out Ken, who's also a real expert in robots, and if we can get a mic to Ken, I don't know, Ken, I'm assuming you could stand up and ask a question, but I'm curious, what's your hit quick on if you have a question, or also just a comment on what you've been hearing so far tonight.
And thank you for dismissing your class early to be here.
I had to, yes, but it was worth it, and I appreciate this because I really think you're saying so many true things, Gary. I think it's really important.
Before you jump into this, so people don't know you, just introduce yourself a little bit and what you do.
I teach at Berkeley. I run a robotics lab there. My name's Ken Goldberg, and I had the pleasure of being in your seat about a year ago or so.
2 years.
2 years, was it?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
And just
With
so people
Pete.
know, I didn't pay you to say any of that. And we've never
Yes.
actually met before. So
That's true. That's true. So a couple things. One is that I wanted to ask you about the Dreyfus reference that you mentioned, because I had the good fortune to work with him at Berkeley, and his argument was very specifically about embodiment. And it came from phenomenology, as you probably know, and his reading of Heidegger, and understanding that to interact, to get a grip on the world, you needed a physical interaction with it. So it wasn't so much that he said it will never happen, but he was arguing in some sense for physical experimentation from very early time. So can you comment a little bit on that point?
The first is I should probably reread his stuff. I first got his book when I was 13 years old, and I haven't read it recently. I'll let you do the math. I'm emeritus, but I'm not that old. Anyway, so I don't know his stuff as well as I do, but I can talk about as I should. But I can talk about the general question about embodiment. My view from the developmental psychology literature.
Can you explain embodiment just for the layperson a little bit?
I mean, roughly speaking, the notion is if you want to learn about the world, you better have a body and you better go experience that world, right? Fair? And my reading from the developmental psychology literature is that there's a version of the embodiment hypothesis that is too strong, and there's one that's quite reasonable. So the too strong one is you must have a body in order to learn about the world. You must engage in the world. There's no knockdown argument, but there are interesting cases like SMA, which I think is spinal motor atrophy or spinal muscle atrophy, where people that grow up never able to experience the world, and they actually learn a lot about it. And there are other literatures like blind children learn an awful lot about language, even though they don't have the same physical experience. There are a bunch of kind of edge cases that make me think that embodiment is not essential. On the other hand, from the developmental psychology literature, it's really clear that kids start learning a lot more once they experience the world. It's really great to have that experience in the world. And it may well be that the ultimate robots learn a lot that way. I mean, there's also side questions like, could you have 3 robots get the actual experience and then pass what they learn over to the internet. But that would just be like an extended version of embodiment. I think that there's probably a lot of value to it. Some of the technical literature on it has kind of left me cold, but I think it's really because of a view about innateness that I don't like. So there are some people who happen to work on embodiment who want the robots to kind of learn everything from experience, whereas my view would be you can learn a lot from experience if, a la Spelke and Chomsky and Kant, you have a strong starting point with which to absorb that information. And there are some people in the robotics community who think about things in that way. In general, just as a sociological accident, I think there tends to be people, and you can agree or disagree, who kind of want to learn everything from the bottom up. And what I would say is get that embodied experience, but start with notions of space, time, causation, object, agent, and so forth. And then you'll be able to absorb the lessons that you get from being out in the world a lot better.
Fantastic. Go ahead. Do you have another follow-up?
No, let me pass it.
You sure?
I'll catch up with them later. But thank you, Gary.
Well, if you had an immediate question, okay.
Well, I am just interested in the robotics question because that's what I work on, and I'm curious if you, I mean, your critique is really astute about the limitations of the perception, but the manipulation is much further behind that.
That's right. I didn't talk about manipulation as much. I think deep learning has actually made some genuine progress in manipulation, but it's exactly the same story about it has to be within the same data set. So there's amazing...
You meaning like picking things up?
Picking things up, or I mean, for that matter, running and jumping might broadly be construed that way. But I mean, particularly picking things up. There was amazing results today, not quite manipulation, by OpenAI, where the systems devise new ways of doing things using deep reinforcement learning. The problem when you read to the end of the paper is always the same, which is these systems are not very generalizable. They don't transfer, to use the technical term that's popular in the literature right now. So my favorite simple example of this is the Atari game system that DeepMind had, which led to their sale to Google, which became Alphabet, played Atari games better than humans, a lot of those games. But there was a catch. So it did it by playing over and over again, and it just had pixels as input and a score as output, and it could move the joystick and press the fire button. That's all it could do. And it was phenomenal at some level because it played lots of different games, which, going back to Barney's thesis, is a hard problem, right? Barney's thesis was why, I guess, I've never read it, I'm going to be honest, but I've read the abstract, and we talked about it. Barney's thesis was about, the value in trying to learn many games rather than just one. If you just learn a single game, then maybe you haven't really learned that much at all. And so it's a good test. And this system appeared to pass that test, but it didn't actually get tested on the crucial question of transfer. In fact, what it did, and this was not obvious to the naked eye, was it learned every game individually. It didn't take what it learned about Space Invaders and apply it to some other game that's a little like Space Invaders. And then there were a bunch of demos. My people at Geometric Intelligence had one demo where we took this system called DQN, put it through a slalom, and we moved the trees in the slalom around, it just totally broke. We never published that because we got busy selling ourselves. But Vicarious did a very similar demo. So they played Breakout with this system, played Superhuman Level, and there's a video claiming that when it does Superhuman Level, Atari Breakout, that it's like learned what the bricks are and this fabulous maneuver of breaking through the wall and getting the ricochet. And it does all that stuff, but it's humans talking about something that they see that isn't actually what they think it is. What it's really done is memorize. It's a little bit better than memorization, but it's close to memorization. So if you move the paddle up, as Vicarious did in a paper that they published, move the paddle up a few pixels, I'm assuming most people know Breakout, the whole thing breaks down. There's no transfer. So what it learned about Breakout and walls doesn't transfer to a very slightly different scenario. And that's still true with basically most of what's going on in deep reinforcement learning. So it helps with manipulation. If your only job is you need to learn to pick up water bottles that are on a table at this height in this lighting condition, then deep learning is actually, or deep reinforcement learning is actually great for that. It's better than anything else that's been tried. But if you, God forbid, have to deal with different lighting conditions or different bottle shapes or something like that, then it's kind of like back to the drawing board.
Fascinating. Let's see hands up a little bit from people. Let's go here. And any other questions, just get your hands up.
Don't let Barney have the last question.
Oh, okay. Can someone get a mic here? Sorry. There's 2 mics, I think, right? Do we have running around?
Thank you. So
could you just introduce yourself?
Sure. This is Murat Aksu with Capgemini North America. A couple of years ago, as I'm sure you're very familiar with it, Facebook had a panic attack with 2 AI bots creating their own language out of Plain English.
They didn't have a panic attack. The media had a panic attack.
Is it? Okay. All right, so but does that mean that if, with some intervention from humans to kickstart the, let's say, bots or AI bots, that they could actually experience and learn and create their own, language or other means of communication?
I suppose it depends how you define it. I mean, the particular work was not that impressive from an academic, technical standpoint. There's been work on evolution of language in simulated machines going back decades. I know a lot of work by, I'm blanking on his first name. I think it's Kirby is his last name. Edinburgh, I might be mangling his name. But there have been people doing this kind of work for a long time. It was kind of an incremental change for that. But the languages are pretty limited in what they can do. It's not, I mean, the main reason to do experiments like that is actually to understand the psychology and the mechanisms of evolution and how languages were generated. If you want computers to talk to each other, you've got TCP/IP and a whole bunch of other protocols. Like there are more direct ways to do that than to have them do these evolving experiments. I mean, they sort of remind me of like twins learning their own languages, but I don't think there's any particular practical import from that. And the real thing that you need for language is a strong semantics, so that you don't just have fluid talk, but that fluid talk means something. Maybe machines will do that at some point. The stuff in the experiments in question weren't even close to that. There's another passage in the book, which is 6 questions you should ask to be skeptical when you read a news account of anything. We didn't run it on that example, but we could have. And there are questions like, is there a demo here I can play with? And if you played with the demo, you'd have been bored out of your mind. I mean, like, and then they're like, how general is it? Well, you would have seen that it's not like a full language system that can talk about anything. It's really, really a narrow system. So that particular thing, sorry to break the news, is just not that interesting a system. But the headlines were great.
Okay, hands up. Okay, Barney, it looks like here, but okay.
Yeah,
and then we'll go back here.
Let's Barney. Barney's going to ask me a question that's so hard that I can't answer.
Well, let's hear it.
I don't want to end on that note,
okay.
so I want to ease
We're going to do that, and then we'll go to you.
So it's great to see you.
Could you stand up and introduce yourself? I mean, you're Barney. We know that.
I'm,
Barney Pell.
Barney Pell, a longtime artificial intelligence researcher focused on generality in AI early on, now primarily a venture capitalist. I really enjoyed the talk. One thing that I thought was giving, well, two big comments or questions. One, we talk about deep learning, and it's really a module. I think your point is it's a module.
Yep.
And I think actually most people would actually agree that it's a module. There's very few systems that are presented which are, all I did was deep learning, right? It's basically deep learning is a piece to do something, except for kind of the raw classification stuff. But all the rest, AlphaZero, right, is not just deep learning.
Can I say 2 things there on the first part?
Yeah.
One is I completely agree about AlphaZero, and I want to come back to it in a second. There are lots of people that run around talking about end-to-end deep learning to do whole cognitive tasks. And in a way, they're my largest target. So the Atari game system was an example of that, and I think gave a false impetus to that movement. There was an NVIDIA end-to-end driving system. All it really did was lane following. It couldn't really make decisions about when to change lanes, and you couldn't like put in an input destination and output destination the way you would in level 5 driverless car. But it was end-to-end deep learning, one deep learning system all the way. Now, there is I don't know if it's a continuum, there's all kinds of possibilities. It's a heterogeneous space. AlphaGo actually is a hybrid system. I didn't use that term today, but it's a central focus, a preoccupation of the book, is to argue for hybrid systems. And hybrid systems are ones that take deep learning as a module, or there may be many deep learning modules, and then have other modules do other things. So in AlphaGo, there is that module, and then, as you well know, there is a Monte Carlo tree search thing, which is much more from the kind of classical tradition of AI with some great statistical enhancements. I think that's actually a model of what we should do. It irks me a little bit that it is almost always described as a deep learning system when it should really be described as a hybrid system.
So I think actually all reinforcement learning systems are actually complex systems. And none of them, even the end-to-end ones, deep learning is simply a function. And so having decided when are we going to explore versus exploit, all these kind of parameters, all the sort of training strategies, all the rest of that stuff how big is your batch, everything. These are basic iterative complex systems, and the deep learning piece is one part even of most of those systems, right? The only ones I think
There's a
that aren't
reward
those
function
are-
and so forth always.
Okay.
I mean, the closest I think that comes to that is the Atari game system, DQN. But I mean, even there, it's not pure.
Even there, there's how often are you going back and redoing
Yep.
and how batching your memory and all the rest of that stuff.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is on natural language, I thought that your comparison, your attack about the best that deep learning has is sort of natural language and GPT-2, I thought that was kind of unfair or off target. There's actually quite a lot of work in using deep learning as a technique in NLP.
In what?
In natural language processing. GPT-2 is a language model used for, and what you're showing is basically used for generation. No one's making the claim that's understanding text, and thus it's following on the text. The underlying transformer technology that kind of, that's demoing part of, has given us like a lot of good breakthroughs. I'm not saying that's anywhere near the end, and I'm absolutely with you on sort of these things don't actually have deep semantic understanding. But I just think that conversation was kind of short around natural language processing.
I hear you. I think that with GP2 and so forth, and BERT and all of these kind of variations, Roberta, I've started hearing people that I think are very bright people start saying, well, but there's a lot of common sense in that system, and you just don't know how much, and so forth. And I think that that's wrong-headed. There are lots of statistical proxies to common sense, but I don't think those systems actually have common sense, and I think people are actually very recently getting very confused about that matter. And in that sense, I don't think that the thing is off target. Now, there's a way in which it certainly was an expositional, technique, right? I couldn't go through the whole literature there. And there are certainly things that people have gotten out of deep learning. There's state-of-the-art parsing and so forth. On the other hand, there is no system that does what we were describing there about making inferences. And so it's as close as anything else. And in fact, when people fool around with trying to get machines to do inference right now, they use some version of those transformer architectures to do it. So it's not like there was some great system at doing that kind of inference that I could call on. I took the best thing that is out there, and it is ill-suited, and that's the part that's sort of expositor, but there is nothing that's well-suited, and so it's sort of how I had to structure the argument.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Let's pick the.
One last rebuttal to that, which is, you gave an example of reading and for science. There actually are NLP systems that are scouring the scientific literature, building ontologies, building knowledge bases.
Absolutely.
Extracting all kinds of facts and relationships in those tasks.
But none of them have the deep level of understanding that I'm getting at. They just don't.
All right, we'll pick that up afterwards here. But let's good conversation. But let's go to this one over here.
Test.
Yeah,
Okay.
just introduce
You
yourself,
are
please.
live.
Good questions.
Hi, my name is Clay. I was wondering, how do we get legislations on board with AI that we can trust, since there's already tension between AIs taking our jobs and it's going to
I think
impact.
the legislature for now is focused on the wrong set of AI problems, well, that's not entirely true. So one set of issues has gotten a lot of attention lately, and I think is good, which are issues about fairness, accountability, transparency. People use the acronym of FAT for that, FAT. And there is some awareness of that. I don't think that there's anywhere near enough regulation about the safety of the systems we have now. There's like the panic attack of the robots that are going to take over the world, which I think is utter fantasy, and it's certainly not anywhere near on the agenda. There are not a lot of people saying, hey, Elon can pump out an over-the-air update that has a bug in it potentially. And there might be 100,000 cars that have a minus sign where there's a plus sign, and that might be really bad. As far as I know, there is no, I don't know what the word is, pro facto, there's no advance legislation of that. So there's post facto, there's liability laws, and if that should actually come to pass, then Tesla will be in even more trouble than it already is if they should have one of these errors in an over-the-air update. But there's no regulation right now that, so far as I know, that really says much about what you need to do. And in fact, driverless cars are very unregulated compared to, for example, medicines, where you need to do many stages of trials and stuff like that.
But do you fear, sorry to interrupt you, but do you fear that it will get to a point where they'll put a stop to what you can build on top of AI?
Well, what we want is something nuanced, right? I don't think that we should ban AI. I haven't made this argument today explicitly, but I think the long-term potential of AI is so strong that we should be working on it. And a quick few reasons are 40,000 people die on the roads a year. Eventually, driverless cars will cut that by 90%. I mean, not tomorrow, but eventually. And then the medical cases that I gave you before are another example. So I think there are a bunch of reasons why we do want to work on AI. There's a risk that we will actually stop it. So driverless cars in particular, I think, are very vulnerable. And if driverless cars get shut down, a lot of AI could get shut down because they're kind of emblematic. And the risk is that some very vivid, terrible thing will happen with driverless cars. So we already have the problem that they do things that are really weird, and that makes people uncomfortable. But so far, the 5 driverless cars that ran into emergency vehicles, nobody died. Teslas are actually phenomenally safe cars because they don't have an engine in the front, and they're well designed in a lot of ways. And so nobody died in any of those accidents. But what if a Tesla wipes out a school bus carrying children, right? Then, Congress is going to do something, and probably they're going to overreact and so forth. So the driverless car field is a bit like, I don't know what the words is.
But could they ban it, though? If something like that happened, they could possibly, say,
they could just shut down AI.
So
Driverless cars and AI in general right now are kind of at the mercy of some relatively random things that might happen, right? And those random things could lead to scenarios where AI gets shut down. I hope that it won't, and I hope that the legislatures will start to be more proactive to try to avoid some of these things that could lead to things that are sort of short-term better because we have the driverless cars off the road, but long-term terrible because we have the driverless cars off the road.
Although, there is a global market too, and it could go all over the place.
Well, that actually relates to the Kai-Fu point, which is like, they'll get shut down here. They're not going to get shut down in China if that happens. So.
Yeah, totally. Okay, can I see the hands of folks that want to ask questions?
We could do like a lightning round.
Okay, there's a guy here. Okay.
Super fast.
We have a lot of guys here. Is there any women that want also? Let's. Oh, there you are. Sorry, there's a new person. Okay, well, let's go ahead.
Okay.
No. We're gonna.
No. You can ask a question.
Okay,
yeah. We'll get with you next.
And then
go
next
ahead.
will be up in the front.
Steve Jones. Very naive potential question is: you talked about innateness in learning. What do you see as the difference between 4 billion years of evolution and really deep learning?
I think that 4 billion years of evolution is a really long time to make structures that work, and that what evolution does is, I'm going to anthropomorphize in a way that is obviously sloppy, just to make it easier to talk about. Evolution finds good ideas and then it uses them over and over again. So the vertebrate body plan took a really long time to evolve, and then once it was there, it spread really rapidly in the vertebrate brain plan and so forth. Or the idea of making a limb with digits. And so these are like subroutines, and they get used over and over. In principle, you could use evolution, not deep learning, but evolution with AI to do the same thing. But the problem is 4 billion years is a really long time. There's a lot of things. And so what happens most of the time when people do evolution in the lab is they get disappointing results because they start from scratch. There's no reason we have to start from scratch. We could think carefully about what evolution has created and take some hints from that. That's a field called biomimicry. We need more of that. The other thing I will say is you can't learn everything. So for example, if you have one kind of color receptor, you can't learn color vision. You have to have some genetic mutation that gives you that. If you have something that emulates learning a simple relationship like f of x equals x, which we call the identity function, and you emulate it over a lot of cases, like all the even numbers and binary numbers, your system may never get you to the odd numbers. So it would be really great to start with something that looks a little like algebra, that you can work over broad sets of cases. And if you don't have that, well, at least so far, I've never actually seen a deep learning system do that. And here's an interesting fact. One of the most important things that makes deep learning work is something called convolution. I missed your background, maybe you're familiar with it. The convolution is an innate structure, an innate way of building deep learning systems, so they have what's called translational invariance, which basically means that you can recognize the water bottle over here if you were trained on it over there. So that's innate knowledge. In principle, it can be learned. And I had a debate you can watch online with Jan LeCun, who invented convolution. And David Chalmers, the philosopher, moderated this debate. I proposed 10 things that I thought should be innate for AI. And Chalmers says, well, surely we're just arguing about the numbers here, right, Jan? How many do you think are innate? And Jan said they don't need any of them to be innate. Even convolution, the thing for which he is famous for and rightly co-won the Turing Award. And in principle, that might be true, but nobody does it that way. Nobody essentially learns convolution. They all build it in because it's a whole lot more convenient.
Well,
I'm arguing for design by intelligent people.
Well, one thing which
It's
is
an important
which related to
nuance.
this before we jump to this next here, and we are getting towards the end here, but it's something I was going to ask you is like, as we understand neuroscience, I mean, because there's an explosion in neuroscience right now, and you're a cognitive psychologist, you know, rooted in human beings before you got into robots and AI. Do you expect any new insights coming out of neuroscience and breakthroughs of how humans work and the brains work that would
Yes,
actually
but not soon.
be applied to AI?
My answer is yes, but not soon. The truth is we just don't know enough about the brain yet to really draw from it. There are lots of really basic things we don't understand, like short-term memory. So if I say, I will meet you over there in 5 minutes to sign books, and you care to have me sign a book, you'll be there in 5 minutes, one trial. Neuroscience knows about a kind of memory where you condition an aplesia over 100 trials or 1,000 trials over a course of a month. It's a different kind of memory. So just that, one example. There's a kind of memory that is foundational to language and human interaction and so forth. We just don't know the mechanism for. And if you don't know the mechanism for that basic bit of memory, then you really don't understand the circuitry as a whole. So we're about to enter a golden era of neuroscience of collecting the right data, which we haven't been able to do before. And the right data being at the single neuron level, or really at the collection of neuron levels, what's going on. Because the neurons appear to be doing the computation. And there I even say appear to, because like there might be lots of stuff inside the neurons we don't understand, having to do with gene expression and proteins. But so as far as we can tell, it's at the neuron level, and we've never really before had like that many neurons at once that we could record from. That's really changed in the last couple of years. So we're collecting the data, but the truth is we have no idea what to do with it. We actually need AI to help us with that. So it is more likely, in my view, that AI will solve the neuroscience problem than that in the short term the neuroscience will solve AI's problems. And that's why we lean heavily on cognitive science, because it's kind of already here and can help us some. In the long term, we will start to be able to understand the wiring diagram. But the humbling fact is, I forget if it was the early 70s or the 80s, we first got the nematode wiring diagram. This worm with 302 neurons in the hermaphrodite. 302 neurons, and 30 or 40 years later, we still don't know how that works. And so, it's not a good place to put our bet for the short term.
Go ahead. Could you stand up and introduce yourself, too?
Hi, my name is Chriselia Binford, and I am, my training comes from English narrative theory, PhD level, and I'm recently moving into neuroscience. So I've got some peer-reviewed work in that field. But I'm so interested in what you were saying, and I'm going to go ahead and sit down for this. So interested in what you're saying. My research partner is a huge fan of yours, so I've been hearing about you for years. And the thing that I was very interested in, as someone who has narrative theory training, is what you said in passing during this talk about the importance of AI understanding space, time, and causality, and augmenting deep learning. And if it's ever going to approach what we humans can do. And I was recently at the International Society for Information Science, the study of information science, and I was listening to Melanie Mitchell, who was saying a lot of things.
Who I had dinner with last night.
Oh, yes. Well, so she was saying a lot of things similar to what you were saying. In fact, gave a talk with some of the same images about AI falling down and things like that. But what I don't remember her saying is that solution about space-time and causality. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about how AI could do that.
Well, what we do in the book, I think, is to try to pinpoint the problem. We don't really have the answer. So we review some of the work that's already been done. We talk about why some of it is useful, not really deep learning at all. So people who haven't read the book will, even just from this talk, realize that we're very critical of deep learning. But eventually we criticize ourselves. We're more on the classical AI side, I suppose, by temperament, and we could criticize that as well. So we talk about some things that classical AI does pretty well. So classical AI works with taxonomy. So if I know that this is a bottle, then I can know that because it's a bottle, it's also an object and has certain properties in virtue of being an object. Taxonomy works great insofar as it goes, but there's a lot of things we need that aren't taxonomy. There are reasoning systems that can make some good inferences, but they're not really very good at dealing with incomplete information. So we point to problems of incomplete information. I take a step back. In temporal reasoning, for example, we know how to build a system that if it kind of knows all of the facts and how they fit in a timeline, can reason that this one's before that one. Like the abstract calculus that you need for time is pretty well understood, and we make some mention of that. But we also point out a lot of places where the systems break down. The grader is one of the examples we use. So in the case of space, we talk about, well, you can represent an object and its physical extent, but you can't reason about the causality that works over it. So we try to say, look, these are the things that can be done, and these are what the frontiers of the knowledge are. And a lot of it ultimately hinges on how you deal with knowledge that is incomplete or partial or inaccurate or things like that. So if you really know all the facts in the domain, then there are actually tools available now that will work well. But the problem is most of the interesting things in life, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's incomplete information. You have to make good guesses. Humans are really good at this, and we just don't really have a great answer yet. I mean, part of why we wrote this book is we hope to inspire some set of graduate students or something like that to say, yeah, that's a problem I can work on. I mean, we hope we articulated a set of challenges. We thought a little bit about Hilbert. I don't think we did what Hilbert did. We don't have that level of precision, but Hilbert set of problems that set an agenda. We didn't give the answers. We try to be as precise as possible about where the problems are in representing space, in time, in causality, some other domains as well. I mean, so understanding other psychological agents. We try to give a lot of examples of cases that are tricky and why they're tricky. We don't have the answers.
Could you, just a quick follow, and then we'll go to you. 2050, 2040. I mean, any ballpark? We haven't.
For when AGI will come, is that what you're?
Yeah, well just not a full,
Where we'll be then?
Yeah. What do you think we'll actually
line on
have
that-
a kind of autonomous robotic AI that has common sense, can act in the world? Not going to be our overlords or anything, but just actually be able to
Christian knows me this next week, right? That's why he's laughing there in the front row. He knows we don't have till 2050. Our funding is not going to last that long. I mean, more seriously.
I know I'm not going to hold you this, but I'm just saying, is that realistic to think?
I probably won't be here to collect on the bet, but we can hope. I think that in 2050 we will have made substantial progress. Machine reading might come by then. I think what we have going for us is there's enormous interest in AI right now. There's a lot of money there, and there's some growing sense of dissatisfaction. And I think that scientific movements come out of dissatisfaction. People realize that something is great, but it's not perfect, and they start nagging at the thing that's not perfect. And I think that that's happening some. So people are, for example, trying to merge what I think is important about classical AI, which is the ability to manipulate symbols, to do essentially algebra or like computer programming, trying to merge that with deep learning. And I'm not sure the right answer is there, or maybe it's here and we haven't identified it yet, or people, not enough people are excited about the right solution yet. There's a lot of solutions lying around. But I think people are working on it. I think that that's good. I think that there is a lot of knowledge to acquire. So like in my company, we're not going to try to build in all of common sense knowledge, right? So, the common sense knowledge that goes into understanding your posture right now, and you're thinking about, food is coming in a minute, and maybe you want to get us out of here, or whatever. Like, that level of chain of reasoning, that's a long time away. Like, probably most of you saw the film Her, and I thought it was a beautiful depiction of what might be to come, but what we don't have right now is the theory of mind. Like, we actually have an example in the book where he says, things are kind of complicated right now and there's too much to deal with. And she goes from that to organizing his email. So like she makes inferences about, hard problems that he needs to solve. And, there are other problems he needs to solve too. But she really understands something about what his goals are, even though they're not all stated. We want to make progress on that kind of thing in the company. We're not going to be able to do it at the level of Her before the next funding round, let's say.
2050, we get Scarlett Johansson in Her, basically?
We might. I think we have a chance at it.
Okay.
It's more like 2050 than 2030, and it's not going to take to 2200, right? So it's not. That would be optimistic, but not insane.
Okay, we're getting down to the last. I've kind of hasn't had anyone over here. Any question there? Okay, then let's get this last right here. in the middle here? Yeah. And then we're going to have drinks here and folks in a second. But go ahead, stand up and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Daniel Brooks, consultant at Slalom. And I was just fascinating talk, really loved what you kind of were pointing out from the different spaces for beyond deep learning, which is needed for this robust AI that we can trust. So I was kind of thinking about the flip side. It's a two-bodied problem with AI, and it's humans. And you were mentioning something about how humans love to see application in one regime and then apply and say, oh, well, this will work perfectly in other regimes. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what's missing to help humans understand where they can and can't trust AI. Do we need like an OSHA labeling for AI?
I think the only way to do that is to have some understanding of what the mechanisms actually are. And part of the reason I go around giving talks like this or writing books like this is to try to equip people to do it. There's a lot of feedback.
Yeah, feedback you got? Okay, good.
One of the models that we had in writing the book, although we don't replicate it by any means, is a book called How to Lie with Statistics. And part of what we're trying to do is to arm people with an understanding of what the systems are and what the assumptions are. So in statistics, a naive person doesn't realize that every statistic has a set of assumptions. And that the statistic is only valid if that regime is true. So like, you probably want your stuff, depending on your statistic, to be normally distributed, which is true for a lot of domains, but not all. It turns out that deep learning basically works. I kind of gave a slide about this that didn't frame it that way. Basically works in a regime where your test data look a lot like your training data. And it doesn't really work outside that regime. And that's not a one-liner. It's not so hard to understand. But you have to understand stuff like that in order to understand, is this particular system, kind of doing something that is plausible with the current technology, because that's what the current technology does. If you really want to understand these things, you have to develop some sense of what the systems are and how they work, there's no shortcut there. We give as many shortcuts as we can. So we talk about like open-ended problems versus closed problems, and these systems work better on closed problems than open-ended problems. But the number one point of the book is AI is not magic. You just can't treat it as a broad brush as if it solves all problems. It doesn't.
And that seems like a reason. I know there's other hands here, but we've kind of reached the end of the time here, and there's still time to have drinks, some more food, and books. You wanted more questions? Grab his book. He'll be signing out there. And let's end this with a big applause for what's been an amazing conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, folks.